Welcome to the 2026 Kansas Garden Hour webinar series. We are so glad you're here. This webinar series started in 2020 and has been a collaboration of the entire K-State Horticulture Extension team. Since the start of the program, we have reached over 113,000 gardeners, just like you joining us today. We are pleased to continue offering the K-State Garden Hour series for free. If you have enjoyed these educational webinars, please consider making a tax-deductible donation to support this program. The link to donate can be found in the chat or on our K-State Garden Hour website. The webinar is hosted by Kansas State Extension. My name is Calla Edwards, and I am the Horticulture Extension Agent for Butler County, based in South Central Kansas. Everyone involved in the development of this series is an extension professional for K-State. Most of us have a background in horticulture education or a related discipline. But most of all, we each have a love for educating and in sharing important gardening topics. Before we get started, we do have a couple housekeeping notes to cover. Please use the Q&A feature for questions related to the presentation. This is where our Q&A moderator will look for questions at the end of the webinar to use during the session. Agents will also be answering some of those questions during the actual presentation today. If you have other questions not related to the webinar, to Zoom or other issues, please use the chat feature. Today's webinar will be recorded and we will post it to our K-State Garden Hour website, typically tomorrow. We will also upload additional resources related to the topic as well. Any of the links that are shared through the chat will be linked on the website as well. Our moderators today are Marcus Hill and Pam Paulson. They will be sharing information through the chat during the presentation and also in the Q&A portion of the webinar. Today's topic is Soil Smarts, Best Practices to Improve Your Soil Health. I am pleased to introduce our speaker today, Shannon Blocker. Please give us a few moments while we transition and share the presentation slides.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Shannon Blocker. I am the County Extension Agent for Agriculture and Natural Resources from Pottawatomie County, Kansas. I have actually been an Extension Agent in Kansas for 23 years, but I have most of my career I have spent doing all things agriculture, including horticulture. So it's a really great opportunity for me to talk to all of you today, and hopefully you'll be as excited about soil health as I am at the end of this presentation today. All right, so we got the welcome poll, and it looks like we have quite a few participants. Do you want me to go ahead and end that, or do one of you guys do that? Okay. All right. So I'm going to share the results real quickly. So the first question was about what processes are or is included in soil health. And here very shortly, you should be able to answer that based off of my presentation today. So I am focusing on the things that we can actually make changes to as well. So it is all of soil physics, soil biology, and soil chemistry. So those were the correct answers for that particular question. Soil formation is a factor in soil physics, but it is not really what I would describe as a factor that is influenced or influences soil health. And then the second question that we had on there was, what can I do to improve soil health? And that was a single answer question. And it looks like the majority, at least 76%, agreed that in this question that the answer is to reduce or minimize tillage. So that is that. We will talk about the other options on there and why they are not necessarily the correct answer for this particular question. So anyway, that sounds like a good way to go get started. And I will move to our next slide. So like I said, with the welcome questions, soil health is really the combination of those physical, biological, and the chemical aspects of soil. And it really is where they all come together and where they intermix. And I think that this diagram does an excellent job of focusing on that there are some aspects of physical and biological and even chemical areas that are maybe not actually part of soil health. And there are places where different ones interact, but where they come together in the middle, that is really the focus of the presentation today and our definition of what we're going to use as soil health. I will say that soil health has many, many definitions. It's kind of a term that has been used a lot in marketing and I don't know, it's kind of a buzzword or something that has developed pretty recently. However, a lot of the basic principles have been an important part of gardening and maintaining soil, basically for as long as humans have been involved in those processes. Oops, sorry. Going fast today. Okay, so when I'm going to start with physical, so that's the physical aspects of soil, and you can see here that some of these are in fact part of soil health, but the black ones that are listed here are less. We are less able to make changes or have an influence on them, or at the very least, our role as gardeners should be to not mess them up. There's not a lot of things that we can do to make them a lot better, but there are some things that we can do to not damage the texture, damage the depth, damage the structure, density, and the porosity. So really more, those are focused on changes that or things that we will do to not, I guess, make our soil less healthy because we did or tried to change them. The aggregate stability, the infiltration, and the water holding capacity are things that are probably a situation where we can make some changes and some things to do. Now, you may question me a little bit about density and some of the other ones, or even structure, and how we can influence those. And we can a little bit, but I want to say that the three that are there in Kansas State University purple are the three that I feel like we can make the most difference in terms of physical soil properties. All right. So, as I said in the introduction, today I'm really focused on things that we can do. There are things about soil that we really can't change. You know, soil is huge, and the soil that we work with may just be a very small portion of it, but even in our relatively small garden types of situations, we are really dealing with a massive body of individual pieces and parts and all of those things. So the best management practices that I'm going to put forth for us to focus on today are ways that we should try to limit or reduce compaction, how we can minimize tillage, or even possibly do no-till, but at the same time, I'm not going to focus on that because that is a very specialty type of situation. How we want to try to keep the soil in place, how we can add organic matter and make it a change to some of those soil physical properties, and how we can maintain, or why we would need to maintain a natural or a more natural soil profile. So I'm going to talk about each one of these individually and kind of highlight some key points. So in our efforts to limit or reduce compaction, we really shouldn't work wet soils. So soils that shortly after rainfall, we really don't want to go out there and do any tillage, try to plant things, or even, as simple as it is, mow our lawns, any of those kinds of things. When soils are really wet, we would like to stay off of them because traffic and even our garden tools that we're using will have negative impacts in regards to compaction and or edges and those kinds of things. A big one that we all may have thought about, at least anyway, is that if you have raised beds, you probably don't walk on those. That's generally a good idea to, if you're constructing them, to make them so that you can reach the center while standing on the outside. You can walk on a raised bed, but of course that is not going to help the soil health of that raised bed type of situation. Another thing that you can do is establish walk and wheel traffic areas. And, if you're thinking more of a lawn or a landscape around your home, or even in a garden or a park, for example, there's usually places where people are focused on walking, and they don't necessarily walk, or at least not very often do they walk across an actual planting bed. And so those are all practical options that you can do, as well as you can create those even in your vegetable garden space if you want to. So there can be places where you are designating as that these are the places that you're comfortable walking, and try to stay off of areas where roots and plants are doing their work as a way to reduce compaction. And then, I guess the most obvious or the easiest to think about one is about the aerating lawns. And that's what my picture shows there, where they're actually taking soil plugs out and then distributing them onto the surface so that they are going about a process to reduce that amount of compaction that has occurred. Now, I will say, from a person who also covers production agriculture, our compaction impacts on a garden situation are vastly less than when we use big heavy wheels on tractors and combines and things like that. But there are still ways that we can strategize to keep in mind that compaction is something that we want to try to avoid. High bulk density is not a goal. All right. I'm going to go a little bit quicker because I get pretty excited about some of these topics. So, reducing or minimizing tillage. One of the key things that I think about is that some people will actually choose to use their rototiller possibly weekly or extremely regularly as a method of weed control. And I would say that from a soil health standpoint, that is not a best practice. You know, trying to develop a situation where you only are going to till or work with the largest body of your soil once a year, or even possibly less, is actually a great idea. Or if you can't do once a year, try to limit that. So it may be once, excuse me. And maybe once or twice, but try to combine some of these things that you're trying to do so that you don't do it repeatedly and repeatedly. So, if you're going to have to lower your pH and you want to incorporate sulfur, do that when you're already going to be doing compost, fertilizer, and things like that. Use a hoe with a cutting action instead of a traditional garden hoe to limit the soil surface disturbance. And that can be really kind of helpful in terms of weed control as well, because a lot of our larger seeded weeds, we're helping them an awful lot if we lower their location in the garden and put them under enough soil so that they can get germinated well. So I gave you an example there in the photos of this one, but I also wanted to show, and it's not great since I have it set on blur, but I wanted to show that this is a garden tool that I bought actually at the Great Plains Growers Conference, which is a commercial horticulture conference that's being held in St. Joe, Missouri. I think it starts on Friday. If not, then it starts on Saturday. But it is a program that Kansas State University and others are involved in for commercial horticulture. The other thing is that you can, and I like this particular tool or the one that I have because it has a cutting action. It has a blade surface there, so you don't have to necessarily dig it into the soil. As much as it is sometimes a controversial subject, be sure to understand that targeted appropriate herbicide use, or if you don't want to use a herbicide, dedicated and repeated some more pulling for some tough perennial weeds will do a great job of helping us improve our soil health and minimize tillage as well. And things like that I'm referring to that you may understand as tough perennial weeds may be dandelions, maybe field bindweed, maybe Bermuda grass. Some of those guys are pretty hard for us to be able to control by just pulling wands for sure. And the only way that we're going to be successful in that may be to use a herbicide or be very, very dedicated about it. And one of the things that I guess I wanted to mention is a product that or a active ingredient that gets a lot of negative press, but that has a lot of benefits for controlling some of these very tough perennial weeds is glyphosate. That product doesn't drift nearly as much. You can literally paint it on with a foam brush, and it is completely inactivated by soil. In fact, if you look at a field where they applied glyphosate when it was windy and a lot of the plants have dust on them, they will not get very good control. So completely inactivated by soil, so therefore not going to have negative impacts specifically about soil health. It must touch green living tissue. So soil health also is helped by conserving soil. And so, choosing a location that doesn't have a lot of slope can be really helpful in your garden practices. Very rarely do we choose to garden on an area that's slopey unless we don't have any other choices. But if you do not have other choices, then you may need to consider terraces, or in your very strongly sloped areas, you may need to consider things like planting grass in that location so that it will have good perennial cover, and you'll be less likely to lose the soil, which will damage the soil health. And then planting cover crops in vegetable gardens and those kinds of things are great ways to help hold that soil and keep it in place. Organic matter is almost always a great idea. And you've probably heard always, and it is, but there are a few caveats that I really want to mention in regards to adding organic matter today in this presentation as in regards to soil health. And the physical parts of that, the advantages are that aggregate stability, the infiltration, and the water holding capacity. A sandier soil doesn't have a great ability to hold on to water. But if we add organic material to that, their water can be held by that organic material much more effectively. And so we can make some positive changes by doing those kinds of things. The other thing, though, that I wanted to mention is that don't forget about the other soil health factors and avoid going to complete extremes. One of the challenges that we run across at times is that we hear that organic matter is what we want to always do, and it's the solution. And I would say that in many ways it is, but our source of organic matter can become an issue for us. For example, if we are using livestock manures, which are a fabulous source of organic matter and many soil nutrients and things that we want, if we apply large amounts of those, our soil fertility can be very, very distorted, and can be much higher than what we would like it to be. And that can cause some environmental concerns and things like that, and even some growth concerns. And there are situations where you may have some diseases or plants that are very sensitive to having wet feet if you have too much water holding capacity. If we think about that, this is an extreme, but there are some soils that are described as boggy. We don't really have a lot of those in the state of Kansas, but places where they grow cranberries or that kind of thing, where have a true organic soil, those particular situations, that water holding capacity, some of our plants that we would like to grow may be negatively influenced by that. And an example that I can think of is that, especially from the plant disease that we all many gardeners are trying to grow, is tomatoes. They're pretty sensitive to a lot of diseases, and we have a lot of things that we have done to help limit disease on tomatoes as far as breeding and those kinds of things. But if they have too much water holding capacity and those disease pathogens can live, and you don't rotate it and you plant the tomatoes to the same location repeatedly, we can run into situations where the plant disease aspects of too much organic matter could happen. And you may wonder what I'm talking about when I talk about too much. In a garden situation, we would like it to be at least 5%. Naturally, we're probably going to be 2.5 to 3 in many locations that haven't had a lot of organic matter incorporated. But 5% is a good goal. 10% is not particularly a concern, at least not from a water holding capacity. But if we, again, if some of these other factors get in there, we just need to pay attention to those things. All right. Soil health, maintaining a natural soil profile. Again, basically, we don't want to try to change our soil texture by adding sand. In many cases, that would result in something resembling concrete. So don't do that. Don't build a structure such as a home or something like that and put the B and C horizons that you see here on top of the soil. So that's not good for soil health. And then one of the things that I think is really important for gardening is to create that gentle transition between an improved soil. So maybe you're doing a raised bed where you have improved that soil. It is possibly a better texture than what your natural soil is, whatever those things may be. But you wanted to make a gentle transition because water in particular is very sensitive to change. It doesn't really like it. So if you have this layer right here, let's say, that is vastly better than the layer below it, water will completely saturate this before it will move any deeper. And so a gentle transition and allowing that to occur by like adding some compost to the existing soil, mixing it together, and then adding your improved soil and mixing that a little bit, and then going with your improved soil on top. Those kinds of situations when building beds are in our best interest to help with infiltration and some of those natural soil profile factors. All right, so moving on to the chemical parts of it. So in soil health, I'm going to say that there's these 5 factors of chemical soils or chemical properties that are impacted by or impact soil health. And the first 3 are the ones that I'm going to say that are probably the most important and the ones that we can make some changes in regards to. And quite honestly, soil health is the chemical aspects of soil health are our easiest ones to have a soil test and those kinds of things associated with. So we're going to focus primarily on things that are going to help our pH be where we would like it to be for the plants that we're trying to grow. Our nutrient levels are appropriate and in appropriate balance with one another, and or our organic matter content are all aspects of that. Cation exchange capacity is largely impacted by organic matter content and the texture of the soil. And it's basically how many places that the nutrients have to attach to the soil particles. But it's not something that we make huge changes in other than by adding organic matter. And the electrical conductivity, mostly that is about not making mistakes or correcting situations where the electrical conductivity got too high. So, all right, best management practices for soil health include do a soil test. So I know that one of the links that is shared or will be shared is to the Kansas State University Soil Testing Lab, which is in the agronomy department at K-State. That is actually where I got my master's degree, and it was in soil fertility. So therefore, you know, I would be very remiss if I did not explain that a soil test is one of the most important chemical aspects of soil health that every gardener should do. And also following the appropriate recommendations. So, you know, ultimately we would need, and I'm going to talk about each one of these separately too, so I'm going to move on here. We want to add organic matter. We've already talked about that one, but that is our big number one thing that we can do. Do feel comfortable about your choice of fertilizer products, and I'll explain that more later. Do not add wood ashes to Kansas soils. Now, if you are in the Southeast United States, maybe that might be different, but I would say for every Kansas soil that I've ever seen, especially a garden soil, and I have worked in Southeast Kansas, where our pH is probably the lowest in the state. I've never seen a garden soil test that recommended adding lime, which is going to have the same action as wood ashes. And in this case, little bit less controlled about it. So I would not add wood ashes, and do not add non-garden products or amendments without recommendations, and I'll cover that more in a second as well. All right, so working on each best management practice here, soil testing. Number one, most important thing that we can do from a chemical aspect of soil health and just soil in general. Holy moly, it's a very low cost way to find out more about your soil. Now, I will say that the soil tests that we conduct at Kansas State University and most cooperative extension or land grant colleges are focused on the chemical aspects of things. In other words, they are a soil fertility type of test. They're considering pH, they're considering individual nutrients, and they are basing that on expected results. And whether their correlation and the calibration of those tests have been properly done for the soils that are within that state. So I would encourage you, if you live in the state of Kansas, use a lab that's in the state of Kansas. And I think that the soil testing lab at Kansas State University is excellent. So I guess I will make a plug for them. And we can do that by contacting your local extension office. And in most cases, I think every case, you can borrow a soil testing probe from them to help you get a good sample. We really want to soil test every 3 to 5 years, and it's important to keep those records. Now, you can soil test every year, but the reality of it is that it's hard to capture true changes, because the process of the chemical reactions and the amount of soil that we're represented or representing with a soil sample is relatively small compared to the amount of soil that's out there in the real world. And so we really want to look at trends over a long time, a lot of times, to really see where we're making changes, especially in things such as organic matter. But also some of our nutrients, we can look at those trends and see where we are going, as well as well if we would soil test every 3 to 5 years. I will say that one of my biggest pet peeves in regards to soil testing is that sometimes people will go out to their garden and they'll just dig up a clump and bring it to me, and they want to run every soil test under the sun on that particular just one clump that they got from their garden. And that happens for agriculture as well. To be honest, I think you're wasting your money, and it's not that much money, but you're wasting your money to do that because it's really important to get a representative sample. And in order to do that, you need to take at least 10 cores. I always tell people the more the better, and I would strongly encourage you to consider somewhere around 20 cores. Even from a very small raised bed garden, you want to get those individual cores that are about an inch or so wide and 6 inches deep to get a good representative sample. So you can see that this diagram here is kind of showing how that they are doing that. And I'm sure that there's lots of information, including on my Pottawatomie County Extension website, videos on how to do that properly, or you can talk to your local extension office. Organic matter is the one thing that you're going to hear in every single category. It is truly the definition of where soil health comes together. And there's some awesome things about organic matter. It is a source of plant nutrients, like the big ones, such as nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. But it also has good sources of some of our micronutrients that are not going to hurt a thing. Most cases in Kansas soils, a lot of our soils do not necessarily need us to add micronutrients or even some of the secondary nutrients. Sulfur might be a possible exception with our cleaner air and some of those things, but and maybe zinc for specific crops. But ultimately, these are NPK are the things that we're most commonly needing to add, and those particular things are very well done when we add certain sources of organic matter. However, you can overdo it. And like I mentioned earlier, livestock manures are a pretty easy way to overdo it, especially if you do it every year or do a very large amount of it at one time. And I have seen situations, where quite honestly, the organic matter contents are appropriate, or they're, maybe a little higher than absolutely necessary. They're, well above 5. They might be, 8 or 12 or somewhere in that range % organic matter. But the phosphorus and potassium levels, and most importantly, the phosphorus levels are incredibly high. And sometimes those nitrogen levels can be pretty high too. And when that happens, we can get into a situation where we are concerned for our environment. In fresh water, so not in rivers and streams and not oceans, phosphorus is our most limiting nutrient most of the time. And if our garden provides a very rich source of phosphorus through the small amount of erosion that we allow to happen, we are meeting the needs of those plants that are going to cause algae blooms and fish kills. So ultimately, don't overdo it. And nitrogen, on the other hand, can cause you more direct concerns, where maybe your plants grow huge and vegetative. I will never forget It was kind of an accident, but I used composted manure in a garden area, and I had one tumbling Tom tomato left over, which is a variety of tomatoes that's a relatively small cherry tomato, and great for containers and that kind of thing. But I had one left over, and so I plopped it into this compost heavy raised bed area. And this tomato got over 6 foot tall and about 6 foot wide, and it didn't produce any flowers or any fruit until very late in the season. And that is because the nitrogen contents were too high. So the other thing that I don't want any of you have to learn the hard way is that there is at least one active ingredient herbicide class called imidacloprid. Or imidapyralid, excuse me, I'm mispronouncing it and mixing up our stuff. But imidapyralid is in some agricultural products. It's primarily used on tame grasses like brome or fescue or things like that to control broadleaf weeds. It is on the label for that particular thing is an example of this diagram that I have over here. And if you use that and the hay is baled and then fed to livestock, that family of herbicide will go through the animal rather fine, but it will still be active. And you don't want to use that for compost, and you definitely don't want to put it on your garden. So just keep that in mind. You need to know where your manure source is and communicate with them, especially if there's concerns for this particular class of herbicides. Now, it is the responsibility of the applicator to follow the residue or whatever, the hay through to this manure stage. But quite honestly, I have known gardeners who have, got some manure from a source, and they definitely had several years of having to struggle to grow a lot of our broadleaf vegetables and things like that because that chemical did carry over. The other thing that is great about organic matter, especially in kind of our Western Kansas types of, or even sandy soils that are located in the Kansas River Valley in Pottawatomie County or other places like that, they can have a low cation exchange capacity. And that's their ability to hold on to those nutrients. And so the organic matter can definitely help those situations as well. All right, I need to keep moving. Do feel comfortable about your choice of fertilizer products. You can use conventional products or you can use organic sources of fertilizer products, but you do need to apply fertilizer if your soil tests indicate that you should. That's a really important thing for soil health. If you mine those nutrients from the soil, because they do exist there, and the microbes in the soil are going to break down the organic matter, and all of that is a very natural process. But if you do not fertilize it, you're essentially going to be mining it, and you'll get poor yield results and a situation where you're not helping soil health or not. But I guess importantly, plants can't use organic sources of nutrients. So that manure that you added or that compost that you added, whatever the particular material is that's organic matter, plants need the microbes to break that down into inorganic forms because they cannot use them in their more complex states. And quite honestly, a lot of microbes need those inorganic forms to be able to to energize themselves in order to do that work there too. So they can use organic directly, but they benefit from some inorganic forms too. Now, admittedly, the soil is going to be okay in that, but you should not feel like adding organic is the only choice of fertilizers because of soil health, because the plants don't care and the microbes will work with whatever you give them, but ultimately they appreciate some balance in that as well. So that's just something to keep in mind when talking about that. So you don't need to feel guilty from a soil health standpoint if you are using commercial fertilizers that are not from organic sources or labeled as organic. You can choose to do those things for other reasons. In Kansas, don't add wood ashes. I already talked about that enough. I stole this image from the web from Sedgwick County. It's going to raise our pH, and we don't need the potassium. And so ultimately, wood ashes are a bad idea for Kansas soils. The last thing that's in this category that I would describe as one of my bigger pet peeves is adding things that are non-garden products based off of social media or a website or something, whether that be Facebook, Instagram, it doesn't matter. It makes me a little bit crazy without a research basis for that recommendation. So ultimately, I have over here that homemade weed killer that probably every single one of you have seen. You may get results from that, but you're actually just burning the tops. So a lot of those plants will come back, especially if they can regenerate and their growing point is below the soil surface. Salt will ruin the structure of soil. So that's bad. Those are unintended consequences. There are negative things from Epsom salt if you get too much of that. In most cases, it doesn't cause any benefits, but in many cases, it doesn't hurt a whole lot as long as you don't go excessive. But we don't need the magnesium that it's contributing in our Kansas soils. So unless your soil test says so, I would say nope. And, even gypsum, which is marketed a lot of times to help loosen up soil. And possibly some people will say that it will make a difference in soil pH. It won't. So you might be spending money that isn't going to get you the results that you want. I really wanted to mention that research-based, in this case, means cooperative extension. And I'm glad that you're all here today to hear that. But there are others, other reputable sources that are going to have research-based ideas. But don't be made victim to some of the trendy things because we want to, reduce the chemicals that we add to our environment. Well, I'm here to tell you that white vinegar, salt, and liquid soap are in fact chemicals too. So that's just something to keep in mind in regards to some of the things that we will find in other sources. Organic matter. We're moved into biology or biological. So organic matter is going to show up again. And then I have the list there of some living organisms. We're not going to make changes to the living organisms. I probably should have purpled the organic matter, but I did bold it. In many cases, we don't really want to add more living organisms. Even the earthworms that we might think about or whatever adding to a situation, those are not going to be our native worms per se. So, ultimately, I think that we want to just manage the living organisms, but we can make some changes in organic matter. Looks like I'm getting close to the end, but guess what? I'm almost to the end of my slides as well. So best management practices, organic matter, cover crops, and then rotating crops. So the first two you've already seen before. The rotating crops is where I'll focus most things, but in the biological aspects of things, organic matter is going to help with aggregation, which is actually partially a physical aspect of soil structure. It's going to make a difference in mineralization of nutrients, which again is kind of where the crossover with chemistry, and then the decomposition of residues. The carbon to nitrogen ratio is something to keep in mind. If you're using wood ashes or even more allowed, I guess, sawdust as a source of organic matter, that carbon to nitrogen ratio is going to be very, very different than 30-1. It'll be closer to 400-1. So you're going to need to add more nitrogen in the environment to be able to support the microorganisms that might be able to break that down. So a lot of times we do not recommend adding sawdust, for example, but that's something to keep in mind. Do grow cover crops, that living root and the thing and that rhizosphere and that interaction between the soil and the exudates that the roots provide and all of that kinds of things are good things. They can suppress weeds, especially our grass related things like rye, oats, that kind of thing. But you do need to consider how you're going to how you're going to terminate that cover crop. So that's something that's really important just to keep in mind, that if you do choose to grow a cover crop, you need to figure out how you're going to terminate it and when, so that you can use the garden as you wish. And the last thing on these categories that I have here is rotating crops. And I'm going to just briefly say that I would recommend doing it by families. If you're looking on social media, etc., they'll talk about doing it based on plants that are that we use the roots, plants that we use the leaves, plants that we use the fruit, etc. That can catch you because tomatoes and potatoes are actually in the same family and even the same genus. So you need to rotate out of those areas. If you go from tomato to potato, then essentially you didn't rotate. That will help with disease suppression, higher yields, and even impact soil fertility, because there are some plants, some garden plants that are higher feeders or they use more nutrients than others. All right, so last two slides. So I do need to hustle, but if your soils do these things that are on here, then yes, you do have a healthy soil. And the key things that I wanted to list here are the huge big picture things that your soil or that you can do, best management practices for soil health. And so you can see here, soil testing, organic matter, minimizing tillage, growing cover crops, rotate garden crops, prevent unintended serious consequences, and pay attention to the relationship between those three factors. And I guess now I'm going to end my slide share for questions.
Okay, just getting wrapped up typing some answers, but we've got a lot of good questions for you, Shannon.
Okay.
I'm going to start at the top here. So, early on, you talked about soil compaction. So they asked about to alleviate that, if there's ways to alleviate, walking on the soil by maybe putting a board down, or if you have to be, working in your garden beds, if that's a possibility.
Yeah, I mean, what a board might do is actually spread out the area that you're impacting. But realistically, your feet are not heavy compactors. Even feet of larger things such as cattle are not major compaction issues, but it is something to think about. So yes, if you need to be out there, having boards or having intentional walkways is a very beneficial thing to do.
Okay. And then what is a way to know that you've got adequate organic matter in your soil?
Test for it.
Okay.
It's the package number 2 for horticulture, or you can just add it on to the basic one if you don't necessarily need nitrogen or necessarily need zinc, which is in the production agriculture one. But ultimately, that soil test is valuable, and doing it maybe not every 3 to 5 years, but at least doing it every 10 years is a great idea. You're not going to make humongous changes in a short amount of time. You might do that more so in a garden than in other locations, but there's like 2 million pounds of soil out there in an acre inch, so or an acre foot. So ultimately, you shouldn't make any real huge changes in 1 year or even 2 or 3 years.
Okay. We had a question about biochar and your thoughts on using that for improving soil health.
I will admit that's one area that I'm a little less familiar with. I do believe that it is it's burned organic matter. I think that it is less concerning by far than wood ashes, for example. But I would encourage you to talk to your extension agents and/or do some other research on research-based institutions about biochar. But I would say for the most part, it's probably an okay thing to use.
And then this one was, she asked if you have advice on working with lawn services. Often they just have a package deal for applying, fertilizer at this time and this amount. How to convince them to go by a soil test that they had, and not applying phosphorus and such.
I would say that as the homeowner or as the person that's paying for those services, if you I think you are in the perfect place to insist that it be done according to a soil test. It may not make them love you as a customer, but if they aren't willing to make adjustments, then they're really not doing a great job of helping people manage their lawns and gardens either. Sorry, but that's the honest truth.
And then we had one about the quinclorac. Does it have carryover in the compost? If somebody were to use that and then compost the.
I know what you're talking about. I don't know that one is listed, but the most important thing to keep in mind is that all of those herbicides or insecticides, any pesticide, is going to have a label. And if there are any concerns about carryover, it's going to be on the label. They have to do a lot of testing. And that's why, quite honestly, I feel a lot safer about using pesticides that are literally labeled for use in gardens and places like that, versus some of our homemade types of things that haven't been investigated. They haven't been. There's no proof that that's better, worse, or indifferent. The process to get a pesticide approved is a pretty intensive process. And so they do test for all those things, and any concerns will be on the product label.
And one of the things I answered to somebody else with a similar question is if you're not sure about what's in the compost, you can take a small amount and just maybe plant some beans or something in there and see if
Yep.
they react to it. So
Absolutely. So briefly, I had a commercial horticulture grower who used a pond for irrigation water, and he mistakenly used he cut some trees on his dam and used Tordon RTU to kill the tree, and the water level came up and it got into the water, and he was killing all of his horticulture plants, especially things like tomatoes. Tomatoes are are very, very sensitive to a lot of those herbicides. So beans or some other crop like that are a good option as well.
well, thank you, Shannon. I think we're done with time for questions, so we're going to turn it over to Kala.
Sounds great.
All right, we typically have more questions than we have time for, but we will be sure to link several articles related to this session on our website. We hope these resources will help to answer your questions, but if you need additional information, please contact your local K-State Extension office. Once again, thank you for joining this K-State Garden Hour series hosted by K-State Extension. We're so glad you could join us today to learn about Soil Smarts, the best practices to improve soil health. You can visit the K-State Garden Hour website to view our recorded Garden Hour archives or to make a tax-deductible donation to support the continuation of this webinar series. This session was recorded and will be posted to the website by tomorrow afternoon. After this webinar ends today, you will receive a prompt to take an evaluation survey. Please fill this out as we greatly appreciate your feedback. If you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at gardenhour@ksu.edu. Thank you again. We hope you continue to tune in each month and have a wonderful week.